Franz Kafka is frequently associated with narratives characterized by absurdity, unease, and a deeply somber atmosphere. Among his most celebrated works are The Metamorphosis, which begins with the protagonist awakening after an inexplicable transformation into a gigantic insect, and The Trial, in which Joseph K. suddenly finds himself embroiled in a legal proceeding whose origin and basis he does not understand. Throughout the narrative, he attempts to determine the nature of the accusation against him, but never succeeds in obtaining a satisfactory answer. It is also well known that Kafka instructed that his manuscripts be destroyed after his death. The preservation of much of his work is therefore due to the decision of his friend and literary executor, Max Brod, who chose not to comply with his wishes. Such a characterization, however, falls far short of capturing the complexity of Kafka's writing. Kafka displayed an especially acute awareness of philosophical and existential questions, without seeking to present a systematic doctrine or philosophical position in his works. In this respect, he bears a resemblance to writers such as Dostoevsky, whose influence on his work is widely acknowledged. Rather than directly formulating particular philosophical theses, Kafka incorporates metaphysical, moral, and existential questions into the situations he constructs and the experiences of his characters. His writing also possesses a humorous dimension that is sometimes obscured by the conventional image of an author dominated by anguish and pessimism. More specifically, it is a form of dark humor. According to accounts of the readings he gave of his own works to friends, Kafka placed particular emphasis on their comic potential. Paradoxically, what may be most striking about his work is not the existential melancholy with which it is conventionally associated, but precisely its recurring humor. In The Trial, Joseph K.'s experience is characterized by a succession of frustrated attempts to prove his innocence, or, at the very least, to understand and overcome the undefined accusations brought against him. The protagonist finds himself within a society dominated by an opaque bureaucratic structure, in which the institutions responsible for administering justice are simultaneously distant and incomprehensible. Along the way, he encounters a variety of unusual figures, many of whom claim to possess the knowledge or connections necessary to assist him. Yet regardless of the strategy he adopts, whether through resistance or an attitude of apparent submission, his efforts seem invariably to lead him into an even more disadvantageous position. One of the work's central passages occurs near its conclusion, when a priest presents Joseph K. with the so-called parable of the law. The story told by the priest establishes an evident parallel with the situation experienced by the protagonist himself. In the parable, a man arrives at the gate of the law with the intention of obtaining justice. A gatekeeper prevents him from entering and orders him to wait. The man remains beside the gate for years, growing old without discovering how he might persuade the gatekeeper to allow him to pass. Meanwhile, he is informed that there are other gates within, corresponding to different levels of access to the law, but he never succeeds in overcoming even the first obstacle. When he is finally on the verge of death, the gatekeeper reveals that the entrance had been intended exclusively for him, and that it will now be closed. Joseph K.'s experience bears clear similarities to that of the man in the parable. Both confront a deeply disturbing reality in which apparently irrational obstacles are presented as ordinary components of the existing order. At least initially, the protagonist accepts the logic of this universe and attempts to find an explanation for events that, from an external perspective, appear manifestly absurd. In this sense, the trial can be interpreted as a kind of extended parable developed through dialogues and situations that, despite their fantastic and absurd character, are frequently described with a high degree of naturalism. Joseph K.'s situation thus acquires a significance that extends beyond the simple narrative of a legal conflict. It may be understood as a representation of the spiritual condition of an individual confronted with a universe whose meaning remains hidden, fragmented, or, ultimately, non-existent. From the outset, Joseph K. appears to sense that the possibilities of liberation are limited. Nevertheless, he continues to pursue different avenues through which he might attain justice and understand his situation. Only at the end does he appear to reach a kind of conclusion, when he definitively abandons the hope of finding a solution to the problem that has pursued him throughout the narrative. The interpretive richness of The Trial helps explain the multiplicity of philosophical, political, and psychological readings to which the work has given rise. During the period of existentialism's greatest influence, Kafka was frequently presented as a kind of precursor to the movement. The protagonist's desperate condition, confronted with a universe devoid of accessible explanations, does indeed appear to anticipate some of the characteristic themes of existentialist literature. Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, developed an interpretation of The Trial that sought to relate the narrative to Kafka's Jewish identity. From this perspective, Joseph K's experience could be compared with the situation faced by Jews in a context of growing anti-Semitism. Individuals perpetually subjected to an accusation whose nature they do not understand, and exposed to the possibility of persecution or punishment without being able to determine in advance when or why it might occur. The work has also been subject to Marxist interpretations, particularly because of its representation of power structures and social relations characterized by inequality and opacity. At the same time, certain aspects of Kafka's personality and experience, in particular, the recurring presence of feelings of guilt and anxiety in relation to social interactions, have contributed to psychoanalytic interpretations. The multiplicity of these approaches demonstrates, to a considerable extent, the difficulty of reducing the trial to a single interpretive framework. From a philosophical perspective, the relationship between Kafka and Dostoevsky becomes particularly significant. Like the Russian writer, Kafka explores the conflict between traditional forms of faith and the search for objective truth, as well as the consequences of the crisis of religious belief and the resulting subjectivization of meaning. The central question may, in this context, be formulated as follows. What place can the individual occupy in a world that offers no ultimate, stable, and universally recognizable meaning? Joseph K. confronts precisely this problem. The universe in which he lives is constituted by legal and social structures that determine individual behavior, even though the foundations of those structures remain obscure. The rules appear arbitrary, yet they possess sufficient force to make resistance to them extremely difficult. The individual is therefore confronted with an unsatisfactory alternative: adapt to the norms established by society, or risk being regarded as a transgressor. Kafka intensifies this experience through a deliberately exaggerated representation of the bureaucracy characteristic of the society in which he lived. The fact that he lived in Prague, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, provides a particularly relevant historical context for understanding this dimension of his writing. Joseph K's anguish arises, in part, from the contrast between his desire to find a simple metaphysical truth and the reality of a world in which such a truth appears inaccessible. The protagonist occasionally seeks an objective form of meaning, but he finds himself embedded in a complex society in which the absence of an ultimate foundation appears to have been incorporated into its very social structures. Oppression, therefore, does not result solely from the existence of an external authority. It also manifests itself through a system of relationships, rules, and procedures that profoundly condition individual experience. For those who have directly experienced societies characterized by repressive political regimes, the trial may acquire an almost realistic dimension. The experience of living under bureaucratic and authoritarian systems can make the atmosphere of surveillance, arbitrariness, and powerlessness that dominates the narrative particularly familiar. In Kafka's universe, the characters who appear best able to adapt to the system are those capable of adjusting their identities and behavior to the demands of the existing structures. Joseph K., by contrast, displays a combination of resistance, self-confidence, and incomprehension that prevents him from fully integrating into that order. The work's relevance, however, is not limited to readers who have lived under openly oppressive regimes. Even in freer societies, the trial retains considerable power to represent a recognizable psychological experience. The sense of powerlessness that emerges when an individual confronts apparently irrational bureaucratic procedures, particularly when these are sustained by rules whose purpose or underlying rationale cannot be understood. Joseph K's experience can thus be transposed to everyday contexts in which individuals find themselves subject to impersonal systems that appear to operate according to an inaccessible logic. Although the trial establishes numerous parallels with recognizable situations of social and political experience, it is above all its philosophical dimension that explains the work's enduring significance. The narrative can be read as a form of dark comedy, but also as a tragedy marked by powerlessness and disorientation. In either case, what remains particularly disturbing is Joseph K's experience of confronting a world whose logic eludes him and forces whose origins and purposes he cannot determine. It is precisely this experience that gives the work its enduring philosophical dimension. Joseph K's perplexity does not arise merely from his involvement in an incomprehensible legal proceeding. It stems from his confrontation with a reality in which the structures that ought to provide existence with meaning appear simultaneously omnipresent and inaccessible. His situation therefore raises a question that extends beyond the specific context of the narrative. Can the world possess an ultimate meaning, or are we inevitably condemned to seek meaning within a universe that will never offer us a definitive answer?